The sun hung heavy and unrelenting over the dusty frontier town of Dry Creek, its rays bouncing off wooden storefronts and creaking saloon doors, as if to remind everyone that time was slow and harsh out here, that debts were paid in sweat, blood, or bullets, and that men who rode into town on business rarely left with their souls untested. Daniel McGraw, known by many as a hardened debt collector with a streak of fairness rare in the Wild West, adjusted the brim of his weather-beaten hat as his boots crunched over dirt streets. He had come for one thing and one thing only, a long-overdue payment owed to a rancher who had borrowed more whiskey than he could handle and more gold than he could repay. Daniel was not a man who relished confrontation, but life had taught him that weakness was preyed upon, and a man without grit lost more than respect. He lost survival. The townfolk watched him with wary eyes as he walked toward the rancher's wagon, and among the murmurs of women peeking from behind half-open shutters and the scuffling of children who darted into alleyways, he felt the familiar sensation of being both feared and resented. Still, his mind was sharp and steady, his resolve unshakable. Yet destiny, as it so often does, had plans far removed from debt and coin. It was behind that wagon, bound but not broken, where he first saw her. She was kneeling in the dust, hands tied behind her back with rawhide, long black braids cascading over her shoulders like rivers of midnight, her dark eyes steady and unyielding despite the sun glaring into them. She wore beaded leather that spoke of heritage and pride, feathers tied in her hair that swayed in the breeze like banners of defiance. The men around her whispered, some mocking, some fearful, calling her Apache girl as if her very presence was a crime against their order. Daniel slowed, his boots halting in the dirt, not because he had never seen a captive before, but because something in her gaze cut straight through him, as though she were not pleading, not begging, but challenging him to see her as more than a prisoner. She looked at him with the fire of someone who had lost everything yet refused to surrender her spirit, and it stirred something in his chest that no debt, no ledger, no gold piece ever had. He asked the rancher, "What's this?" His voice carrying a weight that silenced even the murmuring crowd. The rancher, a stout man reeking of sour whiskey and arrogance, spat into the dirt and said, "Spoils of a raid gone wrong. She's Apache. Caught her out by the canyon. She'll fetch a fair trade or a lesson." The words burned in Daniel's ears, and though his mission was simple, to collect what was owed and leave, he felt the lines between right and wrong blur with every second he stood there. The rancher laughed, offering a bag of coins he clearly couldn't spare, but Daniel barely glanced at it. His eyes stayed on the young woman, who lifted her chin defiantly as if daring him to either condemn her or free her. The world around him seemed to fade. The voices of the townsfolk became distant. The dust swirling in the air seemed to slow, and the pounding of his heart grew louder than the jingle of coins. Daniel was a man who lived by rules, but he had also lived long enough to know when rules were chains rather than guides. "Untie her," he said flatly, his voice steady like a gunshot in the silence. The rancher blinked, confused before scoffing. "She's not yours to command." "She's mine. My debt is settled. Take the gold and ride." Daniel stepped closer, his hand brushing the butt of his revolver, his shadow falling long across the kneeling woman. "Your debt," he growled, "is not settled with stolen lives. You owe me coin." "Not her." The air grew thick as men around them shifted nervously, hands twitching toward holsters. The Apache woman's eyes widened ever so slightly, surprise flickering across her proud features, as though she had not expected this stranger to speak for her. The rancher sneered, his pride inflamed, but Daniel's cold steel stare left no room for argument. Slowly, with curses muttered under his breath, the rancher sliced the rawhide and let the woman's wrists fall free. She rubbed the red marks on her skin, but instead of fleeing, she rose gracefully, standing beside Daniel with a dignity that made her seem taller than every man around. It was in that moment, amidst the dust and tension, that something unspoken passed between them. She could have run, disappearing into the desert shadows where her people once roamed, but she did not. She stood beside him, as though silently claiming him as ally, maybe even more. Daniel, whose life had been a long series of ledgers and collected debts, suddenly felt as if he were the one in debt, to fate, to her, to this chance to make a choice that mattered. He led her away from the wagon, ignoring the glares and muttered threats of the rancher and his men. The townsfolk whispered louder now, gossiping of scandal, of betrayal, of a man who chose an enemy's daughter over a neighbor's coin. Yet Daniel didn't care. The woman, silent but watchful, walked at his side, her steps steady, her spirit unbowed. He asked her name as they reached the edge of town, his voice softer than before. But she only studied him with unreadable eyes. Finally she spoke, her voice carrying the strength of mountain winds. Ahyoka. He repeated it quietly, committing it to memory, feeling the weight of it anchor into his soul. That night, as the stars blazed cold and brilliant over the desert, Daniel built a fire at his camp and offered her food. She accepted with calm grace, eating in silence, her eyes always scanning the horizon. He wanted to ask why she stayed, why she didn't flee. But something told him she was choosing, testing, deciding if he was a man of words or of worth. And deep down, Daniel knew the answer mattered not just to her but to himself. As the night grew long and the fire burned low,